In late February, early March 2014, the Russian armed forces captured the Crimean peninsula and, in violation of all international norms, Russia turned the Ukrainian Autonomous Republic of Crimea into a subject of the Russian Federation. But the violent annexation of Crimea is not recognized neither by Ukraine nor by other European and world powers. Meanwhile, the Russian authorities call the military occupation of the Crimean peninsula the return of Crimea to Russia. To justify the illegal annexation of the Crimea, Russia is trying to manipulate the history of the peninsula by resorting to dubious historical arguments, some of which have already become generally known myths. They are using all possible methods to do this, including distortion of ancient Crimean history, dissemination of outright lies, and, of course, defamation of the entire Crimean Tatar nation, which does not at all fit into the Crimea is ours paradigm and hence is at all myth. The main reason for the creation of such myths, according to historians and scholars, is the complete absence of any legal arguments justifying the ownership or hegemony over the Crimean territory by Russia.
Відповідно, одних лише так званих юридичних аргументів російській стороні було невдосталь.
Accordingly, the so-called legal arguments were not enough for the Russian side. According to lawyers and political scientists, Russia involved so-called historians to prove paramilitary to Russians, foreigners, politicians and journalists and Ukrainians to a lesser extent that Russia allegedly had the historical rights to Crimea. And all these so-called Russian historical arguments are based on fraud or manipulation of historical facts. These fallacious arguments aim to prove that Crimea has always been primarily Russian land, that Crimea always belonged to Russia, and that Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars have no relation whatsoever to the peninsula. All this meant that if that was not the case, there would never have been any annexation of the Crimean peninsula in 2014.
Ну і зрозуміло, з цього всього випливало би, що в 2014 році не було ніякої анексії.
One of these manipulators relates to the referendum of January 20th, 1991. That day, in the first legitimate local referendum held in the USSR, the population of Crimea voted for the restoration of the autonomous status of the peninsula within Ukraine, not Russia.
Через місяць після того Верховна Рада тоді ще радянської України відновила Кримську автономію в складі УРСР.
A month after that, the Verkhovna Rada of the then Soviet Ukraine resumed Crimean autonomy within the Ukrainian SSR. And now, as you can see, some of the so-called Crimean leaders present that event as the first step of returning Crimea to Russia, saying that then they renewed their autonomy and almost separated from Ukraine. The next step was holding of the second referendum in 2014. Actually, there were no plans to restore the autonomy of the Crimea within Russia. All those documents featured the Ukrainian SSR, and of course the autonomy was reborn in the Ukrainian SSR and then simply carried over to an independent Ukraine. This is a clear and classic example of how Russian propaganda alters the truth of certain historic events in such a way that it suits the needs of the Russian authorities in the Kremlin.
Російська пропаганда підлаштовує під свої потреби.
There is yet another myth that is actively disseminated by the Russian side. The thing is that in 1991, after the collapse of the USSR, Crimea was supposedly passed to Ukraine by pure accident. However, it is difficult to argue with historical facts. First of all, at that time, Kiev had been the capital of Crimea for almost 40 years, not Moscow, so nobody passed anything on to anybody. Secondly, 54% of Crimean citizens expressed their support of Ukraine's independence at the all-Ukrainian referendum on December 1st, 1991. And finally, a number of intergovernmental agreements were signed between Kiev and Moscow from 1991 to 1997, among them the Budapest Memorandum and the Great Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Partnership. These documents confirmed that both parties recognize the territorial integrity and inviolability of the borders of one another. Historical myths about Crimea are based on the claim that it internally belongs to Russia.
Хоча насправді це не так. Крим
Although that is actually not true, when we speak of whom Crimea belongs to, it is obviously the Crimean Tatar people. Its statehood was formed at the Crimean Peninsula, first as an independent state and then as a sovereign of the Ottoman Empire. But again, from 1774 to 1783, it was formally an independent state.
1973 року формально це була незалежна держава.
With the support of the Empress Catherine II and assistance of the Russian army, a pro-Russian dissident of the Khan generation, Shahin Jurai, took office into the Khanate of Crimea in 1777. His pro-Russian orientation and the departure from Islamic patriarchal traditions caused discontent and the revolt of his subjects. However, all those protests were suppressed by the Russian army. Bloody executions of the opposition finally set the Crimean Tatar society against Shahin Jirai and made his further stay in the Khanate impossible. Under the influence of internal and external factors, he renounced his power in favor of the Russian Empire. Using this, Catherine II issued a decree called an adoption of Crimean Peninsula, the Taman Island, and Kuban for the Russian state on April 8, 1783. So Russia illegally annexed Crimea back in those days. The Kuchuk-Kayanardi peace agreement signed on July 15, 1774 between Russia and Turkey proclaimed Crimea an independent state. Then Russia, relying on the will of the Khan, who had already been displaced from the throne, literally seized Crimea.
Є такий дуже цікавий історичний факт. В 1782
There is a very interesting historical fact. In 1782, after the suppression of the last Tatar uprising against the Russian puppet Shahin Jirai, the Turkish government proposed Russia to hold a referendum as to who the Crimean Tatars want to be with Russia, or to be an independent state, or to be with the Ottoman Porte. Russia rejected that proposal because it was not to its advantage.
Це було невигідно.
Russia understood that Crimea would never voluntarily agree to an alliance with it, because a constant strife lasted between the two sides for centuries. For example, starting with 1551, long and debilitating wars were waged between the Crimean Khanate and Russia for years. Every year, the Crimean Khan Delvet Jirai led military campaigns to Moscow. On May 24, 1571, he even reached Moscow and burned down most of the city. After the annexation of Crimea in 1783, the Russian Empire began the process of forced relocation. According to the revision of 1793, 10 years after the annexation of Crimean Khanate by the Russian Empire, there were a little over 6,000 Russians on the entire peninsula, and the further increase in their numbers happened not through natural population growth, but by pressure on the royal government of the Crimean Tatars. In the 1860s, there was a turning point when the number of Crimean Tatars that immigrated abroad exceeded the number of Crimean Tatars on the peninsula. Due to the relocation of peasants from central Russia, the number of Russians in Crimea reached 1/3 of the peninsula. Every time Russia happened to be in Crimea, it tried to erase historical memory and change the path of history to its own benefit.
Хотів би сказати про роль пам'яті. Власне, в тих процесах 1783 року про роль пам'яті...
I would like to talk about the role of memory in the processes of 1783 and the role of memory in the processes in 2014. Then and now, Russia attempted to erase that memory of Crimea in people's minds. When we speak of the historical memory of the 18th century, there is precisely the Crimean historical memory, starting with the renaming of settlements. Simferopol was then given a Russian name, though it was historically Akhmakat. Sevastopol and many other settlements were given a Russian name. This was done especially to erase the Tatar names of cities from the memory of the Crimean Tatar people. It was easier to talk about the Russian Crimea with Russian names, just as it is today.
Крим з російськими назвами.
Russians renamed not only Simferopol. After the deportation of Crimean Tatars in 1944, the city of Karazu-Bazar became known as Belogorsk. The seaside town of Hozlev became Yevpatoria, and the ancient Kaffa was renamed Feodosia. The mass renaming happened in May 18, 1948, when the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR, 1,062 names of Crimean Tatar settlement disappeared from the map of Crimea. Instead, they were replaced by Malinovkas, Mironovkas, Demyanovkas, Ivanovkas, Chapaevkas, Komsomolskis, and Oktyabrskayas. Another myth that supports the alleged belonging of Crimea to Russia is that Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gifted Crimea to Ukraine in 1954 when he was drunk. What actually happened was the leadership of the Crimean region had asked the RSFSR Council of Ministers to transfer Crimea into the Ukrainian SSR. The official justification was that this was due to the commonality of economies, territorial proximity, and close economic and cultural ties between the Crimean region and the Ukrainian SSR. Hence, the next myth that Ukrainians had allegedly appeared in Crimea after the peninsula was unified with Ukraine. There are various myths about when Ukrainians appeared in Crimea. Some say it was sometime after 1964. We would like to remind that 100 years ago, the first Congress of Ukrainians in Tavria was held in August. Then, in 1919, the Congress of Ukrainians of Crimea. Then the Ukrainian Crimean Regional Council was established. According to scholars, Ukrainians began to massively develop Crimea in the mid-19th century. Here is what the famous Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Dashkevich wrote in his study Ukrainians in Crimea. In 1856, serfs and peasants of the Verkhodniprovsk and Katerinosyalv countries started massively fleeing to Crimea. Later, they were joined by peasants from countries in the Kherson, Kharkiv, Poltava, Chernigiv, and Kursk provinces. Military checkpoints were set up on roads, which led to fights with peasants. There were many deaths who set off to Crimea with their families and all their belongings. The reason for that migration was the spreading of rumors that refugees from Ukraine would be settled in Crimean cities destroyed by war. Although most of the peasants were tucked back, some managed to break through to Crimea. Although most of the peasants were turned back, some managed to break through to Crimea, where they could count on the help of their compatriots who settled in Crimea earlier. By 1856, the majority of the urban population in Simferopol were Ukrainians. Experts say the myths that Crimea belongs to Russia are countless. Those include twisted pieces of history, the economy, the settlement of the inhabitants of the peninsula, and the Crimean Tatars, and the annexation of Crimea. These myths were created and continue to be created in Russia to limit people's access to truthful information.